Hey everyone, welcome to yet another inane car review. And in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Kia Carnival, which is a people mover. Obviously it's branded differently in different territories, but it's pretty much the same regardless of the territory you're in. And I'm going to be looking at several key features of it, such as its performance, such as it is, the handling practicality, the general comfort and interior design, and overall the storage and practicality of the car. And I'll give you my thoughts on the positives and negatives about the Kia Carnival. Now overall, my overall impression is it's perfectly adequate. There's nothing necessarily massively negative about it, but nothing necessarily hugely positive about it. It does the job adequately well. It looks acceptable for a car of this nature. The performance and handling is acceptable and industry standard. It lacks some of the technology that I'd like. However, again, it does everything acceptably well, and I'm not going to hate the car, but I don't especially love it either. And I'm not going to be clamoring to get back into it, but I'm not hating my experience driving it. And that's pretty much my overall view. Adequate is my overall view on it. Now, if you have any thoughts about the car though, drop those in your comments below. And otherwise, it would be great if you click the like and subscribe buttons. And if you somehow find this video hugely insightful, then obviously share the video, although I very much doubt that's going to be the case anyway. So with that in mind, let's start on looking through the car and the key attributes of it. So the first thing I'd talk about is performance. Now that's a weird place to start with a people mover because performance is not necessarily something you're even looking at. However, it does need to be adequate for you to not hate living with the car. Now here it is adequate. It has a bit over 250 horsepower if you get the petrol version. There is of course a diesel version as well. The diesel version is slower. The diesel version, however, is diesel, so it's going to be a little bit more torquey and probably a little bit more bulletproof. In any case, it's not super slow, but it's not a performance car. The engine itself is perfectly reliable. There's nothing majorly negative to say about it. Now, in terms of the actual acceleration, which is not something you necessarily buy a car like this for, the acceleration here is really going to get you from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour or 0 to 62 in around 10 seconds or so. Again, the exact numbers you get vary a little bit on the article you're looking at, but we're looking at around 10 seconds or thereabouts. Now, to put that in perspective, I had an old Porsche Cayenne from 2011, mind you, that did that in a little over 9 seconds, so it isn't the slowest in the world. Admittedly, mine was a diesel, it was from 2011, it was old, but still, it's acceptable. It's livable to have that type of performance. And it's going to struggle with some things though. So, the types of things it will struggle with is if there's a steep hill, that's where it kind of struggles, and where the Cayenne did a much better job. It is slow going up hills. I suspect that if you have a heavy load, that will also add to it. The acceleration is also not great in the top end, so it's okay when you're going from an immediate stop. So the car is obviously more designed for inner city or situations where you don't need major acceleration. Now the handling here is not unsafe by any description. You have reasonable visibility over everything when you're driving. I wouldn't say that when you're parking, but when you're driving you do. So you can see perfectly well out the back, you can see out the sides, the side mirrors are large, which is great, rear vision mirror is perfectly fine. So when you're driving, the visibility is fine. The driving position is also quite good. That's for a couple of reasons. A, you're raised up, kind of like an SUV, and also B, the front end is quite short. So because it's quite short, you don't actually have to see over very much, which is good for, well, short people. And when you're driving, it feels comfortable. So the car will absorb most bumps. It certainly is not wafty, but it will absorb the worst of it, and you're not going to feel like you're going to need a chiropractor after you've driven this car for any length of time. So driving experience is adequate. It's not fun, it's not sporty, but it's adequate for a car of this nature. We can also think about the driving experience when we're talking about parking. Now this is where it has some issues. Now granted, I'm not driving the latest model, but it is a big car and you can feel the size of it when you're trying to park. So if you try to reverse into a parking space, you don't want to do that before you're really used to the car, because it would be nerve-wracking trying to not hit someone else. But also it doesn't have great parking sensors or parking sensors at all, and the reverse camera in this car is small, not high resolution, a little bit washed out. So it isn't very easy to see what's behind you when you're reversing, which obviously creates some issues if you're actually trying to see what you're reversing into. The lack of good reverse camera is a major issue, but in any case, adequate when it comes to performance and steering, but not brilliant is pretty much how I'd sum it up. We can then look at things like technology. Now the technology here is again okay, but not great. By okay, I mean there is an infotainment system, but it isn't a good infotainment system. So by that I mean the screen is not large, it's small, very small. The reverse camera doesn't work very well. In terms of Bluetooth and connectivity, it has Bluetooth, but only really for calls. So it isn't really going to be great if you need to connect your phone and want to play music. There is obviously a USB port and a 3.5mm jack, but that's not going to be particularly great if you want Bluetooth connectivity, particularly for people in the back using their phones. So it doesn't keep up with the modern technology there. It certainly does not have Android Auto or Apple CarPlay if you want that, which then relates or creates this other issue in terms of GPS maps. It won't have a GPS map, and you'd need to rely on your phone. But without Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, you would need to be using your actual phone rather than connecting it to the car. So technology there is sorely lacking. It also doesn't have many modern features in the form of things such as a properly responsive touchscreen and the other things you'd come to expect, such as that proper connectivity and proper infotainment system features. In terms of other technology, again, it's lacking in other areas. So turning our attention to the gauge cluster, there really is not much information there. Basically 2 analog dials and a very small screen in the center. The small screen is set in a way that makes it look much larger than it actually is. It's basically just a small digital screen. Nothing to really report on there. It is kind of old school and adequate. Other technology is again hit and miss. There are electronically controlled mirrors, which you can control from the driver's door panel. However, it lacks some other things. For example, the seats are manual. Now granted, you could get versions with automatic seats, but the one I'm in at the moment doesn't have them. So you are going to have that as an issue. If you really want automatic seats, you're not going to have them here. So overall, technology is not great. It has the bare minimum, but it isn't wonderful, is pretty much the overall summary. Now in terms of comfort and the interior, well, the interior is not the worst I've been in, but it's not the best. The best way of putting it is it's better than a lot of Toyotas, but it still isn't good. So the interior, when it comes to like the dash panel, it looks better than some cheap cars, but still not great. So it has that textured plastic, which is trying to create sort of a leather type appearance, which doesn't really work. The rest of the dashboard looks adequate for the segment, but certainly is not brilliant. I wouldn't be saying that it's anything to be especially astounded by. So the dashboard is not great. The center console again is adequate, but nothing especially amazing there. Some of the nicer parts is they do have some glossy black plastic, which makes it look a little bit more expensive than it actually is, but it's still not wonderful. In terms of other things, such as the steering wheel, which is what you'd be touching all the time, again, that's plastic, which is a little bit annoying for a car like this, because it's not dirt cheap, so you would expect it to be at least okay. But again, it's plastic. The whole steering wheel is plasticky. It's kind of like the base level steering wheels you get in Kias, which is not particularly great, but at least it's hard wearing. The seats themselves, again, there are options you'd have with these, but the ones I'm in at the moment are cloth seats. Cloth seats are cheap and they're comfortable enough, but they pick up stains. So particularly if you get them in beige, they can easily look pretty nasty after a while. And you kind of don't want to actually think about what's been on the seats when you look at them. So not wonderful there. And the cloth is all throughout. So again, that's not great. However, making up for this is things such as legroom and comfort. So there's certainly enough space in this car, at least enough space in the front and rear seats, which makes it okay in terms of transporting people for a long distance. People aren't going to be ripping their hair out if they have to sit in here for an extended time. However, again, it's not going to be a luxury car, it's going to be a comfortable, adequate car is the best way of putting it. The Carnival has 3 rows of seats, Obviously the front row, then you've got the middle row, and then you can also raise up the rear row. Now the middle row is adequately comfortable. I wouldn't want to sit in the middle of it, but it's at least adequate. There's armrests, there's cup holders, there's also a USB port in the rear, albeit not a USB-C port. The main rear row of seats is probably the least comfortable. There isn't much legroom, they're quite small, you really would only want children there. They obviously have their own window and they have cup holders, but it still isn't going to be a pleasant place to be. So you wouldn't use it for long trips or for large people, but it at least is nice that it's there, even if it probably will never actually be used by the vast majority of people. Now the raising and lowering aspect of it is a little bit finicky. It is not automatic and it obviously requires manual operation. It takes some getting used to, it isn't difficult, but it does take some effort to raise the seats, and it isn't totally obvious exactly what you need to do until you've done it a couple of times. So I'd say it isn't the easiest to raise up, but it certainly is not going to be that painful if you're only doing it once or twice. So in short, enough space for all of your passengers, wouldn't want to be in the rear row, middle row is okay, front row is probably the most comfortable, which is pretty unsurprising. Now, when we're also thinking about comfort, the storage aspect of it is again quite passable. So in terms of the front, we have the center console, which has quite a deep storage bin. We have the cup holders, which again are quite good. We have effectively 4 of them, depending on how many people are in the back. You've got the 2 in the front, and you've got 2 in the center console, which are perfectly fine. You also have the door bins as well, which can hold things like that. So there's definitely enough storage for keeping your things around you. There's also the glove box, and there's this weird storage compartment above the glove box, which isn't really that useful, but it's there in case you need it. We can also think about rear storage. Now, rear storage in the boot is A, quite accessible, and also B, quite spacious, which is what you would expect and want from a car of this type. So by quite accessible, getting into it through the trunk lid is very straightforward. Again, not electronic, but very straightforward. You can also lower the rear seats in order to add additional room. So if you're transporting large things, this is quite a decent option, as long as you don't need the rear seats. Now, what about styling? Now, for a people mover, styling is not really going to be at the top of your list. However, if it's something you're interested in, the Kia Carnival does it acceptably. It's much like with everything in this car, it's acceptable. It doesn't look particularly interesting, but it doesn't look particularly bad. And let's face it, all these people movers look kind of the same. No one's going to be staring at these thinking, oh wow, it's a people mover. Then no one is looking at these cars. So it looks adequate, it's not ugly. And everything in the car is not necessarily that ugly. I wouldn't be too concerned about any of that. So in summary, what are the plus points? The plus points are basically that it's quite practical in that it has a lot of space, it is adequately comfortable, the performance is passable enough, it isn't very expensive. So basically it does everything acceptably well without costing a lot of money. The main downsides are that it isn't particularly nice or luxurious, it feels like a big car, the infotainment system is dated and lacks a lot of modern technology, and the rear vision camera, or the reverse camera rather, is small, not brilliant, and you'd want something larger for a car of this size. So those are my main views on this Kia Carnival. It is a perfectly adequate people mover. It isn't really a great SUV competitor, in that you'd probably be better off with just an ordinary SUV, but it is comfortable enough, the driving experience is adequate enough, and there's nothing necessarily massively negative to say about it. But there's nothing necessarily massively positive to say about it either. So in short, those are my views on it. I hope they've been somewhat helpful to you, especially if you're looking at buying one of these cars. And if you have any thoughts on the car, drop it in the comments below. Otherwise, it would be brilliant if you liked the video and click the subscribe buttons. And in any case, I very much hope to see you for future videos. Bye.